The desert don't care if you're Apache or white, buzzards circle the same. But when Jake Morrison saw her stumbling through the sagebrush that August afternoon in 1883, gut shot and dying under the merciless Texas sun, he knew one thing for certain: some choices define a man forever. 4 cowboys had been riding hard across the scrubland when the movement caught their eye. At first, it looked like a wounded deer, the way she moved through the brush. Then she fell, and they could see what she really was: an Apache woman in a torn dress, blood soaking dark against the fabric. "Ain't our problem," muttered Collins, reining up his horse. "Could be a trap," added Hayes, hand moving to his rifle. "Indians mean trouble," said the third. "Let's ride." But Jake Morrison dismounted without a word. He walked slow toward the dying woman, his boots crunching on the dry earth. She collapsed just as he reached her, the bullet hole in her stomach visible now, fever burning her dark skin. His water was precious, maybe their last until the next well, 20 miles off, but Jake tilted his gourd anyway, letting clean water touch her cracked lips. "Jake, you gone loco?" called Collins. She's dying," Jake said steady. "That's all that matters right now." The other 3 cowboys shook their heads and rode off, their dust clouds trailing behind them like judgment. And that's when Jake heard it: thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. But whose riders were coming? Just then, Steadfast's ears pricked forward, something moving in the rocks ahead. But it was only a jackrabbit, spooked by the commotion. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The 3 cowboys had disappeared over the ridge, their parting words hanging in the hot air like a curse. "Your funeral, Morrison. Don't expect us to bury what's left." Jake knelt beside the Apache woman, studying her wound with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen too much blood. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good. No lead fragments to dig out. But she was burning with fever, and the way she breathed told him her time was short without proper care. He'd learned field medicine during the war between the states, patching up boys from Ohio and Georgia who'd never see home again. The knowledge came back to him now like muscle memory. Check for bleeding, clean the wound, stop infection before it spread. His hands moved steady while she watched him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to weigh his every action. The powder burns on her dress told a story Jake didn't like. Close range shooting meant someone had stood right next to her when they pulled the trigger. This wasn't some random attack or war party raid. This was deliberate, personal, and cruel. "What kind of yellow-bellied coward shoots an unarmed woman?" he muttered, tearing his own shirt to make proper bandages. She tried to speak, weak sounds that might have been Apache, might have been Spanish, might have been English. Jake couldn't make out the words, but he responded to the desperation in her voice, the human need for comfort in the face of death. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentle as a father's. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Just trying to help." She was maybe 25, with the kind of quiet dignity that shines through pain. Her dress showed she'd been traveling, no war paint, no weapons. Just a woman far from home who'd met with violence. The fabric was good quality, suggesting she wasn't some desperate fugitive, but a person of standing in her community. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the sky red and gold. Jake faced a choice that could cost both their lives: risk the dangerous ride across open ground to his ranch, or stay here exposed and hope they survived whatever was tracking them through the night. His cabin sat 5 miles northeast, built near a clear spring that had drawn him to this particular piece of desert. It had clean water, real medicine, walls that could stop bullets. But getting there meant crossing territory where every shadow might hide an enemy rifle. Every rock formation might conceal an ambush. Steadfast nickered softly, sensing his master's turmoil. The big bay gelding had carried Jake through 3 years of war and 4 more years of frontier solitude. If any horse could make this dangerous journey, it was him. Jake lifted the woman as gentle as he could manage. She was lighter than he'd expected, too light, like the desert had been stealing her substance along with her strength. He settled her carefully on Steadfast's back, then swung up behind her to keep her steady. "Got a place with clean water and real medicine," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "Just hold on a little longer." The ride across open ground felt like crossing a shooting gallery in broad daylight. Every sound made Jake's hand move toward his rifle. The cry of a hawk overhead, the rattle of wind through dry grass, the distant howl of a coyote waking early. But Steadfast carried them true, his hoofbeats steady as a drumbeat against the hard-pan earth. When Jake's ranch buildings finally came into view, silhouetted against the darkening sky, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The cabin sat solid and square among cottonwoods, with smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked his morning fire. It looked like sanctuary, like safety, like home. Jake carried the woman inside, laying her gentle on his own bed, the first time another person had used it in 4 years. By lamplight, he could see her wound more clearly. The infection was setting in, red lines spreading from the bullet hole, but it wasn't too late if he worked fast and careful. He heated water over the fire, cleaned the wound with carbolic acid that made her gasp and stiffen, applied fresh bandages torn from his good Sunday shirt. She watched every move he made, those dark eyes testing him, measuring his character through her pain. When he turned away to give her privacy while tending the wound properly, something shifted in her expression. It might have been surprise, might have been approval, the first hint that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. Jake worked through the long night, checking her fever every hour, changing bandages when they soaked through, making sure she took water whenever she stirred. Somewhere around midnight, her breathing steadied. By dawn, the fever had broken. That's when he heard horses approaching from the south, moving fast, with purpose, and heading straight for his door. Sheriff Tom Kane rode up with 2 deputies just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, their horses lathered from hard riding. Jake had known Tom for 4 years, a decent man trying to keep peace in country where peace was scarce as water. But the grim set of his face said this wasn't a social call. "Jake, we heard you picked up an Apache woman yesterday. That true?" Jake stepped onto his porch, positioning himself between the lawmen and his door. "She's hurt bad, Tom. Moving her now would likely kill her." "Federal orders came down from San Antonio yesterday morning," Sheriff Kane said, not meeting Jake's eyes. "All Apache to be turned over to cavalry immediately, no exceptions, no delays, no excuses." "Even dying women?" "Especially dying women. Colonel Brass thinks she might have information about war party movements, raids being planned, that sort of thing." The 2 deputies shifted restless in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Jake knew both men. Murphy was young and eager to please, while Henderson had been a soldier himself and understood the weight of following orders. Neither was naturally cruel, but badges and federal authority could make good men do terrible things. I'm asking you as a friend, Jake," Tom continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Turn her over, and there won't be any trouble for you." Jake's voice stayed level, but something in his eyes made all three lawmen take notice. "Some things a man can't compromise on, Tom. This is one of them." "Damn it, Jake. You're putting me in an impossible position here. Nobody asked you to come out here. Federal Marshal did." Direct orders. Inside the cabin, the Apache woman had wakened at the sound of voices. Through the window, Jake could see her propped up on one elbow, listening to every word. Her eyes met his, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not fear, but approval. She was testing him through this crisis, measuring what kind of man he really was. Her slight nod was acknowledgment and encouragement both. Sheriff Kane noticed her alertness too. "She's awake. She understanding what we're saying?" Before Jake could answer, a new sound rolled across the canyon. War drums, low and rhythmic, like a giant heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The Apache knew where their daughter was, and they were announcing their presence to anyone with ears to hear. The drums changed everything. What had been a law enforcement matter suddenly became something much more dangerous. "Jesus Christ," muttered Deputy Murphy, his hand moving to his gun butt. "How many you figure?" asked Henderson, scanning the ridges with a veteran's eye. "More than we want to tangle with," Sheriff Kane replied. He turned back to Jake, desperation creeping into his voice. "You got maybe 12 hours before this gets completely out of hand. After that, I can't protect you. Never asked you to." The lawmen exchanged glances, understanding that Jake Morrison had drawn a line he wouldn't cross. They could try to take him by force, but that would mean shooting a man they respected over a principle they weren't sure they disagreed with. "Your choice, Jake," Tom said finally. "But when the cavalry gets here, they won't be as patient as we are." The three riders wheeled their horses and departed, kicking up dust clouds in their hurry to report back to their superiors. Jake watched them go, knowing he'd just made enemies of men who'd been friends. Inside the cabin, the Apache woman struggled to sit up. When Jake moved to help her, she spoke for the first time, not in Apache, but in clear, educated English. "Why did you help me?" The sound of her voice hit Jake like cold water, not just because she could speak his language, but because of what he heard in it: intelligence, dignity, and something that might have been a test. "You've been understanding everything we said out there. I wanted to see what kind of man you really are." She told him her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her people's tongue. But the Apache called her Silent Moon, one who sees clearly in the darkness, who watches and judges before speaking. She was daughter to a medicine woman, educated by Christian missionaries, but raised in the traditional ways. Jake found himself talking about things he hadn't shared with another soul in years, about the war, about losing his family to cholera, about coming west to find something resembling peace, about 4 years of solitude on this ranch, building something with his own hands, living by his own code in country that respected strength over law. They worked together as the morning progressed. She taught him the proper way to prepare healing tea from desert sage and other plants he'd never noticed. He shared what he knew about wound care and frontier medicine, knowledge bought with blood in a dozen battles. There was something peaceful in the work, something right about two people from different worlds finding common ground in the simple act of healing. When she told him quietly that in her language, Jake meant protector of the innocent, He felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant since the war ended. By afternoon, they both understood that trouble was coming like a summer storm, inevitable, destructive, and close. Jake checked his ammunition, secured the water supply, made sure the cabin could withstand whatever was heading their way. Ayanna insisted on helping despite her injury. "I will not be burden," she said firmly. They worked mostly in silence, but understanding passed between them with each shared task. The torn shirt that now served as her permanent bandage became a symbol of sacrifice freely given, comfort offered without thought of reward. As evening approached and they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Ayanna noticed the old scars on Jake's arms, shrapnel wounds that had never healed quite right. Without asking permission, she began to clean and rebandage them with the same gentle care he'd shown her. "Been a long time since I cared whether I lived or died," Jake admitted. "Desert teaches patience," she replied. "Water remembers kindness." When she pulled an eagle feather from her hair and offered it to him, Jake understood it was more than a gift. It was recognition, blessing, acceptance into something larger than himself. "For courage that comes from the heart," she said. He gave her his mother's silver cross in return, the only thing he'd kept from his life before the war, for protection and God's blessing. The exchange felt sacred, binding them together across the vast gap between their peoples and their pasts. That's when they saw the lights flickering on the distant mesa. Not just a few torches, but dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in patterns that spoke of discipline and planning. "My people are honorable," Ayanna said quietly, watching the lights. "But blood law is sacred. They sing of justice and blood debt." Jake counted what he could see and did the arithmetic. Even with all his war experience, all his ammunition and preparation, the odds were hopeless. "Whatever comes," he said, taking her hand, "we face it together." Through the window, Jake saw more torches gathering on the ridges to the north and east. They weren't just surrounded. They were completely encircled by forces that could wipe them out whenever they chose. But the real shock came at dawn, when the Apache warriors revealed themselves in the growing light and Jake could make an accurate count. There weren't dozens of them, or even 100. There were 200 Apache warriors positioned on every ridge, in every canyon, at every approach to the ranch, and they were all waiting for something. Dawn revealed war paint and eagle feathers on every ridge surrounding the ranch. 200 Apache warriors positioned with the precision of a military campaign. Jake counted coup sticks and battle scars through his spyglass, recognizing veteran fighters who'd survived decades of warfare against impossible odds. "They sing of justice and blood debt," Ayanna translated as war chants echoed across the canyon like ancient thunder. But Jake's most immediate problem wasn't Apache warriors. It was the dust cloud approaching from the east, moving fast with the morning sun glinting off metal, federal cavalry, riding in formation with sabers and rifles, ready for action. Colonel Marcus Brass arrived like Judgment Day itself, leading a full company of blue-coated soldiers in perfect military order. He was the kind of officer Jake had learned to distrust during the war, all polish and protocol, with the dead eyes of a man who'd never seen real combat but wore authority like armor plating. The colonel's ultimatum was delivered with military precision and civilian arrogance. "Morrison, you have until sunset today to turn over the Apache prisoner. After that, you'll be considered a hostile collaborator and dealt with accordingly." "She's not a prisoner," Jake replied. his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd actually led soldiers in battle. "She's a guest in my home, recovering from wounds. She's a hostile combatant harboring military intelligence about Apache war party movements and planned raids against civilian settlements. Federal law regarding Indian hostiles is quite clear on this matter." Jake stepped closer, close enough to see the calculation in the colonel's cold eyes. "What I see is a wounded woman who needs medical care. That's all that matters to me." Colonel Brass's smile held no warmth, no mercy, no recognition of human dignity. "Dead Apache don't cause problems for settlers. Morrison. I'd advise you to remember that simple fact." As the cavalry established a military camp within rifle range of the cabin, Jake realized he was caught between two completely different concepts of justice, one ancient and personal, rooted in tribal law and family honor, the other modern and institutional, based on political expediency and racial hatred. Neither side seemed interested in compromise. Help arrived from an unexpected quarter when Doc Henley's ancient wagon came creaking up the trail, medical supplies rattling in the back and defiance written across his weathered face. "Boy, you've got more sand than sense," the old physician announced as he climbed down from his wagon. "But I purely admire the hell out of it." Doc Henley had been the territory's doctor for 30 years, tending everyone from cattle barons to outlaws to Apache when they'd trust him enough to seek treatment. If anyone understood the human cost of hatred and violence, it was him. "Brought extra supplies," he said, unloading bandages and medicines with practiced efficiency. "Figured you might need them before this business gets settled." While Doc examined Ayana's wound and pronounced her healing remarkably well for someone who'd been gut-shot 3 days earlier, Jake worked on turning his ranch into a defensible position. But Ayana surprised him with tactical knowledge that came from a lifetime of watching Apache war strategy. "They will not attack at sunset," she explained, studying the warrior positions through the window. "Apache way is to let the enemy worry through the night, let fear make them weak and foolish, then strike at dawn when their spirits are lowest." "What about the cavalry?" "White soldiers fear night fighting. They will wait for full daylight and clear visibility before making their move. That gave them maybe 12 hours to find a solution that didn't end in massacre. 12 hours to prevent a bloodbath that would destroy both communities and accomplish nothing except adding more graves to an already bloody frontier." As evening fell and cook fires began twinkling on the ridges where Apache warriors waited, Jake and Ayana sat by their own fire, planning escape routes and discussing what might happen if their defenses failed. But more than military strategy passed between them in those quiet hours, an intimacy born of shared danger and growing understanding. "Tomorrow is not promised to any of us," she said, her voice soft in the firelight. "Tonight is a gift we should not waste." Jake felt something awakening in his chest that he'd thought the war had killed forever. Hope, purpose, the possibility of happiness beyond mere survival. "Haven't felt this alive since before the war ended." She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. No words were needed. They both understood what was happening between them, and what they might be about to lose. Through the window, they could see campfires dotting the hills where Apache warriors maintained their patient vigil. In the opposite direction, the cavalry's regulation fires glowed like fallen stars against the darkness. "Two armies," Jake murmured, "and us caught in the middle of whatever's coming. Not armies, Ayana corrected gently. My people seek justice according to ancient law. The soldiers seek something else entirely. That something else became clear when rifle shots cracked across the valley, but they weren't coming from Apache positions. Someone with military weapons was targeting the cabin, trying to kill them both before morning could bring complications. Jake pulled Ayana to the floor as bullets shattered windows and splintered the wooden walls he'd built with his own hands. He returned covering fire from his Henry rifle, but the sniper had already vanished into the rocks like smoke. That was not Apache weapon, Ayana said urgently when the shooting stopped. My people use bow and arrow in sacred combat, never the white man's rifle for assassination. Jake examined the bullet holes by lamplight and found military-issue ammunition. 45 to 70 government rounds fired from a Springfield rifle. Someone wearing a blue uniform wanted them dead, but who and why remained a deadly mystery. As midnight approached with both armies maintaining their positions, Ayana made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the inner lining of her medicine pouch, sewn so carefully she'd never noticed it, was something that had been placed there without her knowledge. A letter, written in precise military script, signed by a federal officer, detailing payment received for services rendered in the Apache pacification campaign. The service described was creating an incident that would justify immediate military action against her people, the massacre of an entire Apache village, including women and children, to clear the land for railroad development. Jake read the letter by flickering firelight, his hands shaking with rage that threatened to consume his ability to think clearly. Lieutenant Samuel Pierce, Colonel Brass's own aide-de-camp, had been paid substantial money to shoot Ayana during what she believed was a peace negotiation meeting. The plan was to leave her body as evidence of savage treachery, providing legal justification for the complete extermination of her people. But Ayana had survived long enough to stumble into Jake's path, carrying evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching from Texas all the way to Washington, where politicians and railroad executives divided up Apache land like pieces on a chessboard. They used you as bait to start a war, Jake said, his voice thick with fury and disgust. And now they want to finish what they started, Ayana replied, understanding flooding her eyes. The sniper, he was not trying to rescue me, he was trying to kill the evidence. Outside, torches were moving on the mesa in patterns that suggested preparation for battle. 200 Apache warriors were getting ready for whatever dawn might bring, unaware that they were walking into a trap designed to justify their complete destruction. Jake looked at Ayana, seeing not just a woman he was learning to love, but a symbol of everything worth defending in a world that seemed determined to choose hatred over hope. We have to warn your people, he said. We have to show them what's really happening here. War Chief Thunderhawk will never believe the word of a white man. Then we'll have to make him believe. Outside in the darkness, 200 Apache warriors waited for dawn and justice, while federal cavalry prepared for a massacre that would be recorded in history books as a glorious victory over savage hostiles. Time was running out faster than water through sand. At first light, Jake Morrison made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would walk into an Apache war camp alone, carrying evidence of federal conspiracy, and try to convince 200 warriors who had every historical reason to kill him on sight that he was telling the truth about their own government's betrayal. War Chief Thunderhawk was a man carved from desert stone and tempered by 60 years of warfare. his face bearing ritual scars and the deep lines that come from carrying the survival of his people on his shoulders. He listened to Jake's words without expression, studying the incriminating letter while Ayanna translated from her position beside the war council fire. The council sat in the ancient formation around their chief, eagle feathers and coop sticks marking individual achievements in battle, war paint and traditional weapons displaying readiness for combat. These were not the savage raiders of newspaper stories, Jake realized with growing respect, but honorable men following laws older than the United States itself. "Blood demands blood," Thunderhawk said finally, his English slow but precise. "But you show courage walking into Apache camp when 200 warriors could kill you with a word. We will hear what you have to say, white man." Jake presented his evidence methodically, using his military training to organize facts and testimony in the clearest possible way. The letter detailing Lieutenant Pierce's payment for creating an incident, Ayanna's first-hand account of the fake peace meeting and attempted assassination, his own knowledge of military tactics and federal Indian policy gained through 4 years of frontier service. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the warriors' initial hostility shifted toward listening attention. Several nodded when Jake explained how railroad companies had used similar tactics in Colorado and Arizona. Others exchanged glances when he described the legal mechanisms that would allow land seizure following a justified military response to Apache aggression. But their careful parley was shattered by the thunder of cavalry approaching at full gallop. Brass buttons glinting in the morning sun and sabers rattling in their sheaths. Colonel Brass arrived with his entire force deployed in battle formation, positioned to attack the Apache camp if his demands weren't met immediately. A three-way standoff developed in the space of minutes, Apache warriors ready to defend their ancient honor, federal cavalry under orders to eliminate hostile Indians, and Jake Morrison caught between two completely different systems of justice. Morrison Thunderhawk's response was delivered with the dignity of a leader who had never surrendered to any enemy in 6 decades of warfare. "This white man has shown Apache heart in protecting our daughter. We do not abandon our own, and he is now our own." The tension was explosive enough to ignite a war that would consume the entire territory. 3 armed forces faced each other in the growing heat of morning, and Jake knew with deadly certainty that one careless word or sudden movement would start a bloodbath that would leave hundreds dead and solve nothing. That's when Sheriff Tom Kane arrived with a civilian posse that changed everything, but whose side he was on remained unclear until he dismounted and walked into the center of the confrontation. The sheriff had been riding hard through the night, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Behind him came townspeople Jake recognized, Doc Henley with his medical bag, the territorial judge, several veterans from both sides of the recent war, and the newspaper editor with his camera equipment. They formed a 4th faction in the growing crisis. "Now hold on, everybody," Sheriff Kane called out, his voice carrying the authority of local law and community respect. "Before anybody starts shooting and regretting it for the rest of their lives, I got something important to say." He carried a thick leather portfolio that he set on the ground between the opposing forces, then opened to reveal documents, photographs, and correspondence that told a story of systematic corruption reaching from the Texas frontier all the way to Washington, D.C. "Been collecting evidence for 8 months," he announced loud enough for all parties to hear clearly. "Evidence of corruption in the federal Indian Service, evidence of illegal land deals that violate every treaty we've ever signed, evidence of military officers taking bribes to manufacture justifications for wars that served nobody except railroad companies and land speculators. Colonel Brass's face went white as alkali dust. "Sheriff, you are interfering with legitimate federal operations and endangering territorial security." "I'm interfering with federal crimes, Colonel, and I've got documentation to prove every word." The evidence Sheriff Kane spread between the opposing forces told a comprehensive story of betrayal and greed. Railroad companies paying federal officials to clear Apache land through any means necessary. Military officers selling government weapons to outlaw gangs who used them to attack both white and Apache settlements, creating fear that justified increased military presence. Planned incidents designed to provide legal cover for the complete elimination of Apache communities. Colonel Brass wasn't just corrupt. He was part of an organized conspiracy that stretched across multiple territories, stealing Indian land and selling it to Eastern investors who never saw the human cost of their profits. Lieutenant Pierce, the young officer who'd shot Ayanna, finally cracked under the pressure of watching his commanding officer exposed before 3 armies and half the territorial government. His voice broke as he made his public confession. "He told me it was for the good of the territory, that we needed to clear the Apache out before they could organize for a major uprising. Said the girl would die quick and clean, that it would look like a routine raid. I was supposed to leave her body where settlers would find it." The conspiracy collapsing around him like a house of cards. Colonel Brass made his final, desperate play. He drew his service revolver, pointing it directly at Jake's chest. "Morrison, you've caused enough trouble for one lifetime." But Ayanna stepped between them, her recovered strength carrying the spiritual authority of her medicine woman heritage. "If you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me first." Thunderhawk's warriors immediately moved to protect both Jake and Ayanna, the man they'd declared their brother and the woman whose life he'd saved. Federal soldiers, faced with the prospect of firing on unarmed civilians and honorable Apache fighters, began openly questioning their orders. The standoff hung by a thread thinner than spider silk, with Colonel Brass's finger on the trigger and 300 lives balanced on the edge of his decision. Then justice arrived, in the form of federal marshals from San Antonio, sent by a territorial government that had finally received reports of the corruption spreading through their Indian service. They placed Colonel Brass under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal treaties. The war that would have destroyed both peoples was prevented by one man's willingness to offer water to a dying stranger, and by the courage of people on both sides who chose truth over convenience. Thunderhawk walked slowly to Jake and placed his weathered hands on the white man's shoulders. His words carried the weight of ancient tradition and personal respect earned through actions rather than words. "This white man has shown true Apache heart," he announced to the assembled warriors, cavalry, and civilians. "He is brother to our people, protector of our daughter, keeper of honor when others chose shame." Under Apache law, Jake had earned the right to marry Ayanna and become a full member of the tribe. Under federal law, the conspiracy was exposed and justice would finally be served. But the most important law of all, the law of human decency, had been upheld by 2 people who chose love over hate, understanding over fear, mercy over vengeance. As the various military and civilian forces began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed into memory, Jake and Ayanna found themselves alone again by the spring where their story had begun. "Water remembers kindness," she said. touching the clear stream that would continue flowing between their peoples long after they were gone. Jake took her hand, feeling the calluses from desert survival and the gentle strength that had helped heal his war-damaged soul. They had found something more precious than gold, more lasting than military victory, more powerful than hatred. They had found each other, and in doing so, had helped their peoples find a path toward peace. The war was over before it had truly begun, ended not by superior firepower, but by the simple act of offering water to someone who needed it. 6 months after the Apache crisis ended, and Colonel Brass was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Jake Morrison's ranch had begun transforming into something unprecedented in territorial history, a genuine bridge between two cultures that had been at war for generations. The cabin had been expanded using Apache building techniques that Jake learned from Thunderhawk's master craftsmen, creating a structure that honored both frontier practicality and traditional desert wisdom. Ayana's garden combined white settlement vegetables with native plants used for food and medicine, producing abundance where survival had once required constant struggle. Their wedding ceremony in early spring had been witnessed by both communities, with Doc Henley officiating under territorial law while Thunderhawk provided Apache blessings according to ancient custom. The old doctor had wept openly as he pronounced them husband and wife, declaring it the finest thing he'd witnessed in 40 years of frontier medical practice. Sheriff Tom Kane had served as Jake's best man, while Ayana's sister from the reservation had traveled 300 miles to serve as matron of honor. The celebration lasted 3 days, with traditional Apache dancing, frontier fiddle music, and enough barbecued beef to feed half the territory. But the real transformation was quieter, more gradual, and infinitely more important than any single ceremony. Jake's ranch had become a sanctuary for people who didn't fit anywhere else, a place where racial lines mattered less than character, where cooperation replaced competition, where different ways of life could coexist and strengthen each other. Former slaves heading north toward Kansas found welcome and employment at the Morrison Ranch. Displaced Apache families, whose reservations had been dissolved by corrupt federal policies, discovered sanctuary and meaningful work. Irish immigrants, Mexican refugees from border violence, Civil War veterans from both armies, all found acceptance and purpose in the growing community. Children played in the ranch yard speaking English, Spanish, and Apache with equal fluency, creating sentences that would have been impossible in their grandparents' generation. The sound of their laughter mixed languages and cultures in ways that pointed toward a different kind of American future. Economic prosperity followed naturally from cultural cooperation. Apache knowledge of desert survival and traditional crafts combined with frontier farming and ranching techniques to create sustainable abundance. Fair trade agreements replaced the cycle of raids and retaliation that had impoverished both communities for decades. But the work was far from finished, and the forces of hatred hadn't simply disappeared with Colonel Brass's conviction. On this particular autumn morning, as Jake walked the expanded boundaries of his property, he saw familiar signs on the horizon, dust clouds that meant people in desperate flight, the movement of refugees seeking safety from troubles that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Ayana met him at the main gate, her medicine bag slung across her shoulder and that look in her eyes that meant someone needed healing. She'd developed an instinct for approaching trouble, a sensitivity to human suffering that Jake had learned to trust completely. "More travelers coming," she said, shading her eyes against the morning glare. They looked badly hurt. This time, it was a Mexican family, grandparents, parents, and 4 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, fleeing violence south of the border where local strongmen were consolidating power through terror and intimidation. Their cart was loaded with everything they owned. Their livestock consisted of 1 injured burro, and the exhaustion in their faces spoke of weeks on dangerous trails. The grandfather had been shot during their escape, a bullet wound in his shoulder that was showing signs of infection. The grandmother was suffering from fever and dehydration. The children showed the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much violence, too much death, too much of what humans could do to each other when they chose hatred over mercy. Jake and Ayanna went to work with the practiced efficiency of people who'd found their calling in life. Water first, then food, then medical care, then plans for whatever came next. It had become their routine, their mission, their way of turning ideals into daily reality. As Jake cleaned the grandfather's wound using techniques learned in war and refined through peace, while Ayanna prepared healing teas and the ranch children played with their new guests, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had sustained him through 5 years of this work. Thunderhawk arrived for his weekly visit, bringing news from the Apache communities and wisdom earned through 7 decades of survival on an unforgiving frontier. The old war chief had become like a beloved grandfather to all the children at the ranch, teaching traditional skills and stories that connected them to the deeper history of their adopted homeland. Doc Henley rode up in his perpetually creaking wagon, medical supplies always ready for whatever emergency might present itself. At 78, he claimed he was too ornery to die and too useful to retire, and nobody at the ranch argued with his assessment. Sheriff Kane brought official news from the territorial capital. The last of Colonel Brass's co-conspirators had been sentenced. Railroad companies were being forced to pay fair compensation for land they'd tried to steal. And new federal policies were being implemented to protect both Apache and settler communities from future exploitation. But the most important news was local and personal. Another successful harvest. Another family helped on their journey toward safety. Another child born healthy at the ranch. Another day the ranch. Another day of proof that cooperation worked better than conflict when people had the courage to try it. As evening approached and the newest refugees settled into the gentle rhythm of ranch life, Jake found himself back at the spring where everything had started 5 years earlier. The same clear water that had saved Ayanna's life now irrigated gardens that fed dozens of people, powered the mill that ground grain for bread, and provided the foundation for a community that shouldn't have been possible according to everything he'd been taught about human nature. Ayanna joined him there, as she did most evenings when the work was done and the children were settling down for the night. They sat on the wooden bench Jake had built overlooking the spring, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. 5 years, Jake said, taking her hand and feeling the familiar comfort of her calloused palm against his. Sometimes it feels like 5 minutes, sometimes like 5 lifetimes. Time moves different when you're happy, she replied, her voice carrying the peaceful contentment of a woman who'd found her purpose in life. When you're building something that matters instead of just surviving another day. Their children, 3 biological to 7 adopted from various refugee families, played in the yard under the watchful supervision of older community members who represented 6 different cultures and backgrounds. The sound of their games mixed languages and traditions in ways that created something entirely new, something that belonged neither to Apache heritage nor European settlement, but to America itself. "Think it'll last?" Jake asked, though he'd asked the same question every evening for 5 years. "Desert teaches patience," Ayanna answered, as she always did. "Good things grow slowly, but they last because their roots go deep." A new rider appeared on the eastern horizon, not refugees this time, but a young cavalry officer carrying dispatches from the territorial government. The military had learned to approach the Morrison Ranch with respect rather than suspicion, understanding that what happened here represented the future rather than a threat to established order. The officer brought news that made both Jake and Ayanna smile with satisfaction. The territorial legislature wanted to study the Morrison Ranch model, to understand how what worked here might be applied to other communities struggling with racial and cultural conflicts. Politicians from 3 territories and 2 states were requesting permission to visit, to learn from their success. Jake and Ayanna looked at each other and shared the quiet satisfaction of people who'd proven their critics wrong through simple persistence and daily kindness. The work was spreading beyond their single ranch, beyond their particular corner of Texas, beyond their individual story of love, conquering hatred. As full darkness settled over the community and families gathered around cook fires to share evening meals, Jake reached for his old water gourd, still kept by the spring, still ready for the next person who might stumble into their lives needing help. 5 years of peace, 5 years of prosperity, 5 years of proving that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that cooperation was more profitable than exploitation, that love was more powerful than fear. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new refugees, new opportunities to choose between the easy path and the right path. Jake Morrison was ready for whatever came next. They both were. The community they'd built together was ready too. The success hadn't come without setbacks and struggles. There had been attempts by outside agitators to restart racial conflicts, economic pressures during drought years when crops failed and livestock died, political interference from federal officials who preferred the old system of segregation and exploitation because it was simpler to administer. Each crisis had tested their resolve and their unity. During the drought of their 3rd year, when Apache traditional knowledge of desert survival became the difference between prosperity and starvation for the entire community. During the attempted raid by a gang of outlaws who thought a mixed settlement would be easy pickings, only to discover that Apache warriors and Civil War veterans fighting together made formidable opponents. During the political investigation launched by Eastern politicians who couldn't believe that different races could coexist peacefully, and who sent federal inspectors expecting to find evidence of corruption, mismanagement, or worse. Instead, the inspectors found a thriving community with lower crime rates, higher literacy rates, and better economic outcomes than any comparable settlement in the Southwest. The railroad that had originally tried to steal Apache land through violence and conspiracy now paid fair wages to community members who worked as guides, translators, and skilled laborers on construction projects throughout the territory. The depot built at Morrison's Crossing had become a major stop on the route between San Antonio and El Paso, bringing prosperity to everyone involved rather than benefiting only distant investors. Jake served as the community's unofficial mayor and official peace officer, a position that required more diplomacy than law enforcement since most problems were solved through community discussion rather than force. His reputation had spread far enough that territorial officials regularly consulted him on matters involving intercultural relations and conflict resolution. Ayanna had become the Southwest's most respected authority on desert medicine. combining traditional Apache healing practices with modern medical techniques learned from Doc Henley and visiting physicians from back east. Her clinic treated patients from hundreds of miles away, and medical students from universities in Philadelphia and Boston came to study her methods. The main street of what was now officially called Morrison's Crossing featured businesses owned and operated by people from a dozen different backgrounds. Maria Gonzalez ran a restaurant serving Mexican and Apache fusion cuisine that attracted travelers from across the continent. Sean O'Malley operated a blacksmith shop where traditional Irish metalworking techniques met Southwestern practicality. The Trading Post, run jointly by Thunderhawk's grandson and Doc Henley's medical apprentice, sold Apache crafts and frontier goods to customers as far away as New York and San Francisco. The Morrison Academy taught children in 3 languages while preparing them with traditional skills from multiple cultures. But on this particular evening, as Jake and Ayanna prepared for another night's rest after another day of building bridges between peoples, a telegram arrived that would test everything they'd accomplished. The message came from Washington, D.C., delivered by a tired rider who'd changed horses 3 times to get there before dark. It was signed by the Secretary of the Interior and carried the full authority of the federal government. New policies were being implemented regarding mixed settlements on territorial lands. All communities containing both white and Indian residents would be subject to immediate inspection and possible dissolution if they were found to be in violation of federal guidelines regarding racial separation and appropriate land use. The Morrison Ranch community had 30 days to prepare for a federal inspection that would determine whether they would be allowed to continue existing or would be forcibly dissolved. With Apache residents returned to designated reservations and white residents relocated to approved settlements. Jake read the telegram twice, his hands steady but his mind racing through the implications. Everything they'd built, every life they'd changed, every proof they'd offered that different peoples could live together in peace and prosperity, all of it could be destroyed by bureaucrats who'd never set foot in the Southwest, who'd never seen what they'd accomplished. "What does it say?" Ayanna asked, reading the tension in his face. Jake handed her the telegram, watching her expression shift from curiosity to concern to quiet determination. She read it through twice, then looked up at him with the same steady resolve she'd shown when facing down Colonel Brass's pistol 5 years earlier. 30 days, she said. 30 days. Jake agreed. They sat in silence for several minutes, holding hands and watching their community settle down for the night. Children's voices calling good night in 3 languages. The sound of evening prayers being offered according to different traditions. The comfortable sounds of people who felt safe and secure in their homes. "We've faced worse," Ayanna said finally. "Much worse." Jake agreed. "But this is different. This isn't about stopping one corrupt colonel or preventing one massacre. This is about whether the federal government will allow people like us to exist at all. Then we'd better make sure they understand what they'd be destroying." Jake squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her confidence. "Reckon we've got 30 days to prove that what we've built here is too valuable to tear down." "Reckon we do." As they walked back toward their home, past the houses where dozens of families from dozens of backgrounds were raising children who would grow up believing that cooperation was normal and hatred was the aberration, Jake felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had sustained him through 5 years of challenges. They'd proven that different peoples could live together. Now they had to prove that the government would let them. The real test was just beginning. The federal inspection team arrived exactly 30 days later. led by Assistant Interior Secretary Harrison Caldwell, a man whose carefully groomed appearance and Eastern mannerisms marked him as someone who'd never spent a night under desert stars or missed a meal due to crop failure. Behind him came a small army of clerks, surveyors, photographers, and federal marshals, all tasked with documenting what they expected to find, a chaotic mixture of races that violated natural law and threatened territorial stability. What they found instead was a thriving community of over 800 people whose economic prosperity, educational achievements, and social harmony exceeded anything in their previous experience. Jake and Ayanna met the inspection team at the community's main gate, flanked by Thunderhawk in his role as Apache representative and Sheriff Kane representing territorial law. Doc Henley stood nearby with a medical bag, ready to treat anyone who might need attention, while the community's children watched from respectful distances, their multilingual chatter providing a constant background soundtrack. "Mr. Morrison," Secretary Caldwell began, consulting his official documents, "I trust you understand the serious nature of this inspection. The federal government has received numerous complaints about unauthorized mixing of races, violation of treaty obligations, and potential security threats posed by your experiment." "What kind of complaints?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse threats than bureaucratic disapproval. "Anonymous reports of Apache war parties using your settlement as a base for raids. Allegations of illegal arms trading. Concerns about the moral degradation that inevitably results from racial mixing." Thunderhawk stepped forward, his aged face calm, but his eyes sharp as obsidian knives. "I am Thunderhawk, War Chief of the Chiricahua Apache. I have lived 73 winters and fought in more battles than you have seen sunrises. There have been no war parties from this place. There has been no illegal trading. There has been only peace, prosperity, and honor." The inspection team spent 3 days documenting everything they could find. They counted livestock, measured crop yields, examined financial records, interviewed residents, and photographed buildings, businesses, and community gatherings. They tested the children's knowledge in English, Spanish, and Apache. They reviewed birth certificates, marriage licenses, and property deeds. At every turn, they found evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. Crime rates were lower than in any comparable settlement. Literacy rates exceeded those of most eastern cities. Economic productivity was higher per capita than the territorial average. Children were healthier, families were more stable, and community cooperation was more effective than anything in their official experience. But their most significant discovery came when they investigated the anonymous complaints that had triggered the inspection. Sheriff Kane's detective work had uncovered the source, a consortium of Eastern land speculators and railroad executives who wanted to purchase Morrison's Crossing property at below-market prices. The anonymous complaints were fabricated by hired agents who'd never visited the territory. Secretary Caldwell found himself in an impossible position. His official instructions were to find justification for dissolving a racially mixed community that violated federal guidelines. His professional observation was that Morrison's Crossing represented the most successful intercultural experiment in American history. The crisis came to a head on the 3rd evening of the inspection, when Secretary Caldwell called a community meeting to announce his preliminary findings. The entire population gathered in the community center that had been built by cooperation between Apache craftsmanship, Irish stonework, and Mexican architectural design. "Ladies and gentlemen," Secretary Caldwell began, his prepared speech reflecting weeks of bureaucratic deliberation. The federal inspection of this settlement has revealed several significant concerns that must be addressed before any final determination can be made. The crowd listened in tense silence, understanding that their entire way of life hung in the balance of this official pronouncement. First, this community operates outside established federal guidelines for racial separation and appropriate land use. Second, the mixing of Apache and white populations violates the spirit, if not the letter, of existing treaty obligations. Third, the economic success of this settlement creates an unfortunate precedent that could encourage similar unauthorized experiments elsewhere. Jake stood up from his seat in the front row, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Mr. Secretary, what exactly are you saying?" Secretary Caldwell cleared his throat, consulting his documents one final time before delivering what everyone feared would be a death sentence for their community. "I'm saying that Morrison's Crossing presents the federal government with a unique dilemma. By every measurable standard, this community is more successful than any comparable settlement in the Southwest. Your children are better educated, your families are more prosperous, your crime rates are lower, and your intercultural cooperation is more effective than anything we've documented elsewhere." The crowd stirred with cautious hope, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. "However," Caldwell continued, and the hope died in 100 hearts, "federal policy regarding racial separation exists for reasons that transcend local success stories. The question before us is whether exceptional results justify exceptional policies." He paused, looking out over faces that represented every color and culture of the American frontier, all united by shared investment in a common home. "I will be recommending to Washington that Morrison's Crossing be designated as an official federal experiment in intercultural cooperation, with continued monitoring but full legal protection. What you've built here is too valuable to destroy." The room erupted in celebration that could be heard for miles across the desert. Proof that hope was stronger than fear, that cooperation was more powerful than division, that love really could conquer hatred when people had the courage to try. Jake and Ayanna found themselves surrounded by their community, their family, as people from a dozen backgrounds celebrated together in languages that blended into a single song of joy and relief. The experiment would continue. The bridge between worlds would stand. The work was far from finished, but the foundation was solid. 6 months after Secretary Caldwell's historic decision, Morrison's Crossing had become a destination for visitors from around the world who came to study what newspapers were calling the Great American Experiment in Practical Democracy. Delegations arrived from European countries struggling with their own ethnic conflicts, from eastern cities dealing with immigrant integration, and from other Western territories hoping to replicate the community's success. Jake found himself thrust into an unexpected role as spokesman for intercultural cooperation, giving speeches and interviews that were published in newspapers from Boston to San Francisco. But he always insisted that the real credit belonged to the community members who'd chosen to trust each other across racial and cultural lines, day after day, year after year. Ayanna had become even more renowned for her medical innovations, which were now being taught in medical schools across the country. But her greatest pride was in the community clinic that treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, their racial background, or their legal status in the territory. The railroad depot at Morrison's Crossing had become a major hub for southwestern commerce, with trains carrying Apache crafts to eastern markets and bringing manufactured goods to frontier communities. The economic prosperity benefited everyone involved, proving that cooperation was more profitable than exploitation when given a fair chance. Thunderhawk, now recognized as an elder statesman by both Apache and federal authorities, spent his days teaching traditional skills to children of all backgrounds while serving as cultural ambassador between his people and the growing settlement. His presence provided continuity with the past while blessing the new ways of life that were emerging from cultural fusion. But the most significant change was in the children who'd grown up in Morrison's Crossing. Now, young adults who thought of racial diversity as normal and cultural cooperation as natural. They were beginning to leave the community to attend universities back east, to work in territorial government, to start their own intercultural families in other parts of the country. The success story that had begun with water offered to a dying stranger was spreading across America, one person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. On this particular morning in late spring, as Jake made his daily rounds through the now expanded settlement, he encountered a scene that perfectly captured everything they'd accomplished. In the community school, children were learning mathematics from a former Apache war leader, studying literature with a freed slave from Louisiana, and practicing music with an Irish immigrant whose fiddle had entertained half the territory. The sight never failed to move him, proof that the future could be different from the past, that children could grow up seeing differences as gifts rather than threats, that America's promise of equality and opportunity could become reality when people had courage enough to make it so. Ayanna met him at the schoolhouse steps, carrying news that would have terrified them 5 years earlier, but now filled them with quiet satisfaction. A new family was approaching the settlement, refugees from violence in another territory, seeking the sanctuary they'd heard about through the informal network of people who helped each other survive on the frontier. Apache family this time, she reported. Father wounded in a raid, mother with 3 young children, been traveling for weeks, looking for somewhere safe. Jake nodded, already mentally preparing for the familiar routine of offering water first, then food, then medical care, then a place to rebuild their lives. It had become second nature, this practice of turning strangers into family through simple acts of kindness, as they walked toward the main gate to meet the newest arrivals. Jake reflected on the changes that 7 years had brought to his life, his community, and his understanding of what America could become when its people chose love over fear. The isolated ranch where he'd sought refuge from war and loss had become a thriving town where people from around the world came to learn how different cultures could strengthen each other instead of threatening each other. The wounded Apache woman he'd found dying in the desert had become his beloved wife, his partner in building bridges between peoples, his proof that mercy was more powerful than vengeance. The spring where everything had begun still flowed clear and strong, now supplying water to hundreds of families who'd found sanctuary in the community that grew around its life-giving source. The water gourd that had saved Ayanna's life was still kept by the spring, still ready for the next person who might need it. As Jake and Ayanna reached the gate and saw the Apache family approaching, Father slumped in his saddle with exhaustion and pain, mother walking beside their horse while children clung to her skirts. They felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had sustained them through 7 years of this work. "Water first," Ayanna said softly, reaching for the dipper that was always kept ready. "Always water first," Jake agreed, opening the gate that had welcomed hundreds of refugees over the years. The work continued, the healing continued, the hope continued, and it all traced back to a single moment in the desert when one man chose to offer water to a dying stranger, proving that the smallest acts of mercy could change the world when they were multiplied by courage, sustained by love, and blessed by time. The Apache father slid from his horse and collapsed just as Jake reached him. His children cried out in fear. Their mother struggled to support his weight. And for a moment, the scene perfectly echoed that first day when Ayanna had stumbled into Jake's path. But now, instead of one man with a water gourd, there were dozens of community members ready to help. Medical supplies immediately available, safe housing prepared for refugees, and a support system that could turn strangers into family within days rather than months. "Easy now," Jake said, lifting the wounded man as gently as he'd lifted Ayanna 7 years earlier. "You're safe here. We'll take good care of you." The man's wife looked up at Jake with the same mixture of desperation and hope he'd seen in Ayanna's eyes that first day. But now there were children from the community already playing with her little ones, Spanish and Apache words mixing naturally in their games, proof that the next generation would inherit a different world from the one their parents had known. As they carried the wounded man toward the clinic that Ayanna had built, with help from Doc Henley and Thunderhawk's traditional healers, Jake felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered, of a life spent building instead of tearing down, of love multiplied across racial and cultural lines until it became stronger than hatred. The cycle continued, the healing continued, the hope continued. Water offered freely to those who needed it, proving day after day that mercy was the most powerful force in the world when people had courage enough to choose it. 10 years had passed since Jake Morrison offered water to a dying Apache woman in the Texas desert, and the story of Morrison's crossing had spread far beyond the Southwest, inspiring similar experiments in intercultural cooperation across the country and around the world. The settlement had grown into a proper town of nearly 1,500 residents, representing dozens of different backgrounds, cultures, and languages. The main street featured businesses that showcased the prosperity that came from cooperation rather than competition. Restaurants serving fusion cuisine, shops selling crafts that blended traditional techniques from multiple cultures, and professional offices where Apache translators worked alongside Irish lawyers and Mexican accountants. The Morrison Academy had become famous throughout the territory for its innovative educational methods, where children learned not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but practical skills from multiple cultural traditions that prepared them for a world where diversity was becoming the norm rather than the exception. Graduates were sought after by universities back east and territorial governments throughout the West. Jake served as the town's first elected mayor, a position he'd accepted reluctantly, but performed with the same quiet competence he'd brought to every challenge over the past decade. His reputation for fair dealing and effective problem-solving had spread far enough that other communities regularly sought his advice on matters ranging from water rights disputes to intercultural relations. Ayanna had been appointed as the territory's first official Indian Health Service coordinator, responsible for establishing medical clinics that served both reservation and non-reservation communities throughout the Southwest. Her combination of traditional Apache healing knowledge and modern medical training had revolutionized frontier healthcare, saving countless lives and training a new generation of culturally competent healthcare providers. Thunderhawk, now in his 80s but still sharp as a cavalry saber, had been designated as an official cultural ambassador by both Apache and federal authorities. His presence at Morrison's Crossing provided continuity with traditional ways, while his blessing legitimized the new forms of intercultural cooperation that were emerging from the community's success. The economic prosperity that had grown from cultural cooperation now extended far beyond the town's boundaries. Trade networks connecting Morrison's Crossing to markets in Mexico, California, and the eastern states had created opportunities for hundreds of families throughout the region. The railroad depot had become a major commercial hub, with trains carrying southwestern products to customers as far away as Chicago and New York. But perhaps the most significant measure of their success was in the young adults who'd grown up in Morrison's Crossing and were now spreading its influence throughout the country. They served as teachers, government officials, business leaders, and community organizers who carried the lessons of intercultural cooperation to new places and new challenges. On this particular autumn morning, as Jake walked through the town that had grown around his original ranch, he encountered a scene that perfectly captured the transformation of the past decade. In the central plaza, children from a dozen different backgrounds were playing together while their parents conducted business in multiple languages. Elderly residents from various cultures shared stories and wisdom on the community benches, and teenagers worked together on projects that combined traditional knowledge from different heritages. Ayanna met him at their usual place by the spring, bringing news of the day's activities and challenges. A new medical clinic was opening in a neighboring territory, staffed by doctors trained in their intercultural healing methods. A delegation from Canada was arriving next week to study their educational system. 3 Morrison's Crossing graduates had been accepted to Harvard University, where they would study law and economics before returning to the Southwest to continue the work of building bridges between communities. 10 years, Jake said, taking her hand as they sat on the bench that had become their evening conference room. Sometimes I can hardly believe what we've built here. We didn't build it alone, Ayanna replied, gesturing toward the bustling community around them. Every person who chose to trust instead of fear. Every family who decided to stay and contribute. Every child who learned to see differences as gifts instead of threats. They all built this together. As evening approached and the community settled into its nightly rhythm, Jake picked up his old water gourd from its place by the spring. 10 years of use had worn it smooth, but it was still sound, still ready for the next person who might need it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I heard there's another family coming through. Former slaves from Mississippi, heading to California, but needing a place to rest and recover." Ayanna nodded, already preparing mentally for the familiar routine of offering water first, then food, then medical care, then a chance to build a new life in a place where background mattered less than character. The work continued, the healing continued, the hope continued, and it all began with water offered to a stranger in the desert, proving that the smallest acts of mercy could change the world when they were multiplied by courage, sustained by love, and blessed by the simple human decision to choose kindness over indifference, cooperation over conflict, hope over fear.